confess to yourself whether you would have to die if writing should be denied to you. As I said, the feeling that one could live without writing is enough to prove that one should not write at all.
The film director René Alliot discovered Rilke when he was 20, a time of questioning. He found the answers in Rilke's work. It seemed only natural that he should direct a film about Rilke, a tribute to the writer and to the writings that had influenced him. Illness and death prevented him from completing his project. This film is dedicated to him.
For it seems that everything is keeping us a secret. Look, the trees exist. The houses we live in still stand. Only we go past everything like a battering of the breeze. And everything conspires to silence us. Half as shame, perhaps, and half as unspeakable hope.
It is a game. You write your name on a sheet of paper, fold it while the ink is still wet, and then unfold it, and read your future in the inkblot. (1912). Rilke was 37 years old when he started to write the Duino Elegies, a cycle of 10 poems which he saw as the culmination of all his previous work. He led a solitary life, entirely dedicated to writing, a wandering existence with no family and no home. It was a choice that he had made. He wanted to possess nothing. Nothing except the German language, but a German language that belonged only to him. 1914. German soldiers leaving for the front. At the time it was said that every one of them carried in his haversack a copy of the Lay of the Love and Death of Cornet Christopher Rilke. Cornet was a runaway success in the bookshops, but its popularity rested on a huge misunderstanding. The most famous of German poets totally rejected Germany, which he considered at best as a foreign land. For more than 10 years he had refused to live there, preferring the life of an exile.
A German writer one day asked me outright to justify my long trips abroad. It was impossible for me to enumerate all the reasons. I merely told him that when I was working I couldn't bear hearing German spoken all around me, often so badly and so lazily, and I preferred to be surrounded by another language with which I was familiar.
1875. Rilke was born in Prague, capital of Bohemia, a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a colony. The Czech population was under the domination of a small German minority that lived in its own world, separated from the country by the dual barrier of class and language. Germans in Prague, Germans in a foreign country. Rainer Maria was an only child. His father, a former officer of the Austro-Hungarian army, was an official of the state railway. His mother, always dressed in black, was a devout Catholic who wrote poetry. None of the many photographs that Rilke kept of his childhood show him with his mother.
When I have to see this lost, unreal woman who is connected with nothing, who cannot grow old, I feel how even as a child I struggled to get away from her, and fear deep within me lest after years and years of running and walking I am still not far enough from her, that somewhere inwardly I still make movements that are the other half of her embittered gestures, and that still I am her child, that some scarcely recognizable wallpapered door in this faded wall that doesn't belong to anything was my entrance into the world, if indeed such an entrance can lead into the world at all.
In 1885, Rilke's parents decided to separate. His father was unable to look after a 10-year-old child on his own. Rainer Maria was sent to boarding school. This was his first long journey. Accompanied by his mother, Rainer left Prague for the military college of St. Pölten. He was to stay there for 5 years. Those years at the military college haunted Rilke until the end of his days. He believed it was the root of all his anxiety and fears. A few years later, he wrote a short piece describing a gruesome gymnastics class in which the weakest member of the class astonishes his schoolmates by climbing the rope as he had never done, and then amazes them even further by dropping dead on the spot. He started to write during his last year as a trainee officer. He was 16 at the time, and 19 when he published his first poems. Verses in the taste of the times, full of mawkish sentiment, his prehistory which later he totally repudiated. Writing his biographical details at the time, he asks himself what he expects from the future, his hope, joy in creation, his fear, going mad, because he has inherited, so he says, an appallingly nervous disposition.
Mother, you made him small. It was you that began him. He was new to you. You curved above his young eyes the friendly world and shut the strange one out. Ah, where have the years gone when your slender bodies simply debarred the surging chaos from him? Much you hid from him thus. You made harmless the room suspect at night. From your heart full of refuge you mingled human space with the space of his night. This much your tender getting up achieved. And, tall in his mantle, his fate withdrew behind the wardrobe, and his troubled future, lightly shifting, adapted itself among the folds of the curtain. And he himself, as he lay there comforted under the drowsy lids of your light moulding, dissolving its sweetness in the first sip of sleep, seemed one well guarded. But within, who fended? Hindered within him the flood tides of origin. Ah, there was no caution in that sleeper. Sleeping, but dreaming, but in fever, how he yielded himself. He, the new, the shy one, how he got entangled in the father-grasping tendrils of inner action coming to pass, already interwoven as patterns, as strangling growths, as shapes of beasts of prey. How he gave himself to it, loved his innerness, his wilderness within, this primeval forest inside him, on whose silent debris of collapse light green his heart stood. Loved, left it, went from his own roots into the powerful sources where his little birth was already outlived. Lovingly he went down into the older blood, the gorges where terror lay, still glutted with the forefathers. And every horror knew him, winked, and knew what was doing. Yes, the monstrous smiled. Seldom, mother, have you smiled so tenderly.
The path that took Rilke from the maudlin poetry of his early days to the Duino elegies began with Lou Andreas Salome. She was 36, had been involved with Nietzsche, and was a writer herself. She was a free woman, scorning convention and the taboos of her milieu and her time. Rilke met her in 1897. He left Prague, which was too provincial, for Munich, where he intended to pursue his ambition to become a man of letters. Meeting Lou was to change everything. She loved him, but did not love what he wrote. She found it glib and imprecise. More articulate and more mature than he, she made him confront his anguish. Thanks to her, he began to understand that, as he wrote later, poetry is not sentiment, it is experience. She also introduced him to Russia, her native country. It was the first time that Rilke had been away from the German world of his childhood, and he eagerly embraced this new land where everything seemed large as life. On his return from this trip, in the space of one night, he wrote the famous cornet that brought him renown. Then he followed on with the first poems from the Book of Hours, and still found time to learn Russian, for he was already planning another trip to Russia. this time to visit Count Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, and Anna Karenina, who had retired to his country estate and given up writing for good, condemning it as a vain and frivolous enterprise, unable to do justice to real life. Rilke gave contradictory accounts of this meeting. In his letters he describes the emotion he felt in the presence of this great man, as one would expect. But in his diary he only writes of his disarray when the elderly man, cutting short his compliments, tells him that writing poetry is absolutely pointless. This response was not the only anxiety preying on him. His relationship with Lou was deteriorating. She could no longer stand his sudden mood swings, his states of euphoria followed by periods of profound depression. She needed to regain her independence. She cut short her trip and returned to Germany. Rilke remained alone.
They were days spent underground, in damp and decay. I fear that such days belong more to death than to life. This absence of hope, this suffocation of the soul. I had to write it down, as a reminder. God help me.
Rilke found help at Worpswede, a community of artists near Bremen, where he sought refuge in the autumn of 1900. There he met Paula Becker, a young painter just back from Paris, excited by the discovery of Cézanne, and her best friend, Clara Westhoff, also just back from Paris, where she'd studied for a year under Rodin. They spoke to him of Rodin, of Cézanne, and of Paris. He read them his poems, told them about Russia, and gradually recovered. In February 1901, Lou announced to Rilke that she was breaking off her relationship with him once and for all. In March, Rilke announced his forthcoming marriage to Clara. Together they dreamed of a union between two artists, pursuing their work, sharing their solitude.
Nowhere, beloved, can world exist but within. Our life is spent changing, and ever lessening the outer world disappears. Where once was a durable house pops up a fantastic image, crosswise, belonging completely to the conceivable, as though it stood whole in the brain.
A few months after the birth of his daughter Ruth, Rilke suffered from a terrible sense of failure.
I thought that the day I had a house, a wife and a child, undeniable realities, things would be better. I thought that it would make me more tangible, more visible. But even if all that exists and is real, for I built this house myself and everything in it, this reality eludes me, and my family are like visitors who refuse to leave.
In August 1902, it was he who left for Paris, alone. He had thought that reality was Lou, then Clara and Ruth. But on arriving in Paris, he had a revelation. Reality was Rodin. Rodin was the pretext for his departure for Paris. Rilke had been commissioned to write something about the sculptor. Rodin gave him a warm welcome. The master took him under his wing, gave him advice. "Work, you must always work," he told Rilke one day when the latter talked to him of his anguish. And Rilke began to write poems, inspired directly by Rodin, others by his discovery of Paris, culminating in 2 volumes of new poems published in 1907 and 1908, which Rilke naturally dedicated to Rodin.
Paris. A great fearful astonishment seized me then. So now again terror assailed me at everything that, as in an unspeakable confusion, is called life.
There was Rodin's Paris, but there was also another Paris, the one where Rilke lived, exiled and impoverished in self-imposed solitude. The social outcasts of the big city reminded him of his own uprooting, and of the failure of a whole area of his life. Rilke decided to express the terror which the sight of disease and poverty inspired in him, but this time in prose. The Notebooks of Malte Lauritz Brigge, a novel with the freedom of poetry. The hero, a young poet in exile in Paris, lives at the same address as Rilke, shares his memories, his hopes, his writings, every word, pens the same letters as he does, and switches freely from German to French.
The existence of the horrible in every atom of air. You breathe it in as something transparent, but inside you it condenses, hardens, takes on pointed geometric shapes between your organs. For all the torments and agonies suffered on scaffolds, in torture chambers, madhouses, operating rooms, under bridges in late autumn. All this has a stubborn permanence. All this endures in itself, and jealous of everything that is, clings to its own dreadful reality. People would like to forget much of it. Sleep gently files down these grooves in the brain, but dreams drive it away and trace the designs again. And they wake up gasping, and let the gleam of a candle dissolve in the darkness and drink the half-bright solace as if it were sugared water. But alas, what a narrow ledge this security is standing on. The slightest movement, and once again vision plunges beyond what is known and friendly, and the outline that was so comforting just a moment ago comes into focus as the edge of terror.
Unable to stand this brutality, Rilke fled Paris and began to travel the length and breadth of Europe. There was nothing frivolous in his wanderings. He was pulled in all directions, trying to hold the various strands of his life together at once. Clara and Ruth, whom he went to visit in Germany several times a year. His paper on Rodin, which took him to Dresden and Prague. And then Leipzig to prepare the publication of Cornet with his publisher. And everywhere he was offered hospitality, in Sweden, Denmark and Italy, and he accepted it in the hope of finding the peace that would enable him to write. But eventually he returned to Paris. In 1906, when his work was starting to gain recognition, his relations with Rodin began to break down. There was too great an inequality. The poet was even the master's secretary for a few months, until the sculptor sacked him, like an employee caught with his hand in the till, according to Rilke. What was tormenting Rilke was Malte. In 1907, the novel on which he'd pinned his hopes was still not finished. And that was enough in his view to reduce all the new poems, all the achievements of the last 10 years, to nothing.
Are we here, perhaps, just to say house, bridge, well, gate, jug, fruit tree, window, at most column, tower, but to say, understand this, to say it as the things themselves never fervently thought to be? And these things that live, slipping away, understand that you praise them. Transitory themselves, they trust us for rescue, us, the most transient of all. They wish us to transmute them in our invisible heart, oh, infinitely into us, whoever we are. Earth, isn't this what you want, invisibly to arise in us? Is it not your dream to be some day invisible? Earth, invisible?
The last great milestone of Rilke's Paris years was the discovery of Cézanne at the major exhibition of his work in 1907, a year after the painter's death. What Rilke learned then, he describes in a dozen or so letters written to Clara.
I can tell how I've changed by the way Cézanne is challenging me now. I am on the way to becoming a worker. On a long way, perhaps, and I've probably only reached the first milestone. But still, I can already understand the old man who somehow walked far ahead, alone, followed only by children who threw stones. Today, I went to see his pictures again. It's remarkable what an environment they create. One feels their presence drawing together into a colossal reality, as if these colours could heal one of indecision once and for all. The good conscience of these reds, these blues, their simple truthfulness, it educates you. And if you stand beneath them as acceptingly as possible, it's as if they were doing something for you. And the humbleness of all his objects. The apples are all cooking apples, and the wine bottles belong in the roundly bulging pockets of an old coat. His fruits become such real things that they utterly cease to be edible, for he is able to stifle his love for the real apple and preserve it forever in the painted apple.
Three weeks after having written the last letter about Cézanne, Rilke learned that the painter Paula Becker, Clara's great friend, who'd been the first person to talk to him about Cézanne, had died in childbirth. Rilke had seen her again in Paris, where she had come, like him, to lead the life of a young artist in exile. She painted his portrait. On hearing of her death, he wrote,
"There's death in life, and I'm amazed that people pretend not to be aware of it. Death, whose merciless presence we feel in every change that we survive, because we have to learn to die slowly. We have to learn to die throughout our entire lives."
And Rilke became invisible. From 1907, he refused to allow himself to be photographed. Taken in secret by one of his visitors, this is the only one in existence from that time. Paris, 1910. Rilke has just finished the notebooks of Malte Laurids-Brigge. A pre-Cézanne book, as he himself said, the book of that discovery by someone who was not up to the task. "Now everything can begin," he wrote. "After Malte, all poetry is possible." Now he really cut loose from his moorings. The fiction of his long-distance love affair with Clara, a fiction to which he had remained stubbornly faithful, was over. Weary of his absence, she asked for a divorce. This tie broken, Rilke set off again. 2 years of travelling: Italy, France, Germany, North Africa, and Egypt as well. And during that whole time he did not write, nothing since Malta. To create, he said, he needed outward immobility and inner turmoil, in a quiet place, far from the city and from people, preferably in one of those old country houses where friends and wealthy admirers were keen to welcome him. But after a few weeks he would grow restless again. He was always the one to leave. In love, too. After his separation from Clara, he threw himself into a series of passionate, intense, but short-lived affairs. A period of being wildly in love, then invariably the breakdown, the impossibility, the end. A pattern that he was unable to stop repeating with astonishing regularity, although he had no illusions about this routine of failure. "I am not capable of being in love," he wrote, "perhaps because nobody has ever affected me profoundly. Perhaps because I do not love my mother." Lou Andreas Salome. Rilke resumed his relationship with her at the lowest point of his depression in Paris. In December 1911, he asked her advice about undergoing psychoanalysis. She knew Freud, had attended the Third Congress of Psychoanalysts and was enthusiastic about the new science. But she also knew Rilke and advised him against it. Throughout the month of December, Rilke insisted. He was at the end of his tether, ready to try anything in order to get better. Then suddenly, he changed his mind.
I know now that analysis would make sense for me only if that strange idea of never writing again, which was often in the back of my mind as a sort of relief while I was finishing Malta, were to become really serious. In that case, one could let the devils be cast out, for in ordinary life they are only disturbing and tiresome.
The reason for this change of heart is quite straightforward. Rilke had suddenly begun to write again after a 2-year silence, and his devils had turned into angels. After Lou, the Princess Marie von Thurn and Taxis was Rilke's closest friend. She had a castle in Bohemia, where he was a frequent visitor, and she also had an estate near Nabrysina in the Gulf of Trieste, on the Austro-Hungarian border. Duino. The castle. It was here that Rilke began the work that had been dormant in him for years, and which would keep him busy until the end of his days. At Duino the wind was always howling. Sometimes it was the sirocco from the south, sometimes the Bora, blowing down from the karst mountains in Austria. On this particular day it was the Bora. Rilke received a letter from Clara's lawyer setting out the terms of the divorce. Preoccupied, he went out for a walk in order to think over his reply, and suddenly, above the moaning wind, he heard a voice cry out.
Who, if I shouted, among the hierarchy of angels would hear me? And supposing one of them took me suddenly to his heart, I would perish before his stronger existence. For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror we can just barely endure, and we admire it so because it calmly disdains to destroy us. Every angel is terrible, and so I restrain myself and swallow the luring call of dark sobbing. Whom can we use then? Not angels, not men. And the shrewd animals notice that we're not very much at home in the world we've expounded. Maybe on the hill slope some tree or other remains for us, so that we see it every day. Yesterday's street has left us, and the gnarled fidelity of an old habit that was comfortable with us and never wanted to leave. Oh, and the night, when the wind full of welkin feeds on our faces. For whom wouldn't it stay, yearned for, gently disappointing night that wearily confronts the solitary heart? Is night more easy on lovers? They only hide their fate from themselves by using each other. Don't you know that yet?
Rilke wrote the first 2 elegies in a few days in a state of exaltation. He already knew that it was only the beginning of a much greater work which he could feel within him, but which he did not have the strength to accomplish. At the age of 37 he was exhausted by the strain he imposed on himself. Overwhelmed by anxiety, his body was no longer able to write. In May 1912 he fled Duino, leaving unfinished the task he'd set himself, to enlarge this world by its greater half, by what we call death, but which is in fact simply the hidden face of life. When war broke out in August 1914, Rilke happened to be in Germany. He stayed there for 5 years, trapped, a prisoner in that German world he'd constantly sought to escape. France, Italy and Russia, his chosen countries, were all in the enemy camp, while the poem written during his youth, the famous Cornet, was applauded in patriotic gatherings. What is the use of poetry? He'd written nothing since 1912, since Duino. His world was in ruins, and for the first time Rilke began to doubt. What was the use of poetry? What was the sense of saying, would you die if you were prevented from writing? when hundreds of thousands of men were dying without any questions being asked? Was the choice to write poetry, for which he'd sacrificed everything, still justifiable at this time of industrial warfare and mass death?
We are the bees of the invisible. We gather the honey of the visible to accumulate it in the great hive of the invisible. The angel of the elegies has nothing to do with the angel of the Christian heaven. It is that creature in whom transformation of the visible into the invisible, which we are accomplishing, appears already consummated. Hence terrible to us, because we, its lovers and transformers, do still cling to the visible.
Ruins and graves. In 1917, that was all that remained of Duino Castle, which had been completely destroyed during the 11th Battle of the Isonzo between the Italian army and the troops of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into which Rilke himself had been conscripted. His status as a great poet enabled him to avoid being sent to the front. He had to spend 6 months working in the war archives in Vienna. Wearing the Austrian uniform, the nightmare of the military college of his boyhood caught up with him.
With full gaze the animal sees the open. Only our eyes, as if reversed, are like snares set around it, block the freedom of its going. Only from the face of the beast do we know what is outside. For even little children we turn around and force them to look backward at the world of forms, and they do not see the open so deep in the animal's eyes, free from death. Only we see that. But the beast is free, and has its death always behind it and God before it. And when it walks, it goes toward eternity as springs flow. Never, not for a single day, do we have pure space before us in which the flowers are always unfolding. It's forever world and never nowhere without not. And we, onlookers, always, everywhere, turn toward everything and never from. We are surfeited. We set it in order, it breaks. We put it in order again and break down ourselves. Who has twisted us like this? So that no matter what we do, we have the bearing of a man going away.
Rilke did not leave Germany until spring 1919. The war came to an end, the revolution swept over Imperial Germany, and war began again. Civil war. The poet was so naive that when Munich was recaptured by bands of trigger-happy counter-revolutionary forces, he forgot to remove from his door the plaque that placed him under the protection of the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic, the Bayerische Räterepublik. His fame alone saved him. He was allowed to leave for Switzerland. He started wandering again, always seeking the things that eluded him. A roof, a companion, the elegies.
All that winter I knew it. I had to concentrate on something. Sadly, that is the worst loss. To have lost something inexplicable, unfathomable.
Rilke in Switzerland, painted by Baladine Klosowska, the last great love of his life. He loved Baladine. He also loved her 2 children. One was to become the painter Balthus, and the other the writer Pierre Klosowski. Rilke read their future in inkblots and wrote nursery rhymes for them. Yes, I've seen. Friend, what have you seen? I've seen a museau that was a chateau in the midst of an orchard. Friend, that's a lie. Written on the backs of 3 postcards. Musot in the Valley region, another castle that rich admirers placed at Rilke's disposal in 1922. For the first time, Rilke felt at home. And the miracle happened. In less than 2 weeks, as once before at Duino, all the fragments, all the scraps of paper, salvaged from these 10 years of silence, at last began to make sense. Everything, even the memories of his first trip to Russia, suddenly fell into place. Rilke had at last reached the end of his true journey. 10 elegies, some 40 pages, to reconcile us with the world.
Why, if it's possible to spend this span of existence as laurel, a little darker than all other greens, with little waves on every leaf edge, like the smile of a breeze, why then must we be human, and shunning destiny, long for it? Oh, not because happiness, that over-hasty profit of loss impending, exists. Not from curiosity, or to practice the heart that would also be in the laurel, but because to be here is much, and the transient here seems to need and concern us strangely. Us, the most transient. Everyone. Once. Once only. Just once, and no more. And we, also once. Never again. But this having been once, although only once, to have been of the earth, seems irrevocable.
Once and no more. The elegies completed, Rilke took leave of his mother tongue. He had reached the limits. He had mastered German. He had made it into a language that belonged only to him. But he did not want to be a master. He still wanted to learn, to be a beginner again. From 1922, he wrote in French, as if he were starting a new life.
I have said my goodbyes. So many departures have slowly formed me since my childhood.
This second life only lasted 4 years. Until 1922, Rilke had held out, driven by the elegies. Once these were completed, there was no longer anything to protect him, and he succumbed to his illness.
Sometimes I feel like the gentle reflection of something that no longer exists. Of course I am ill. But isn't sickness the most decisive departure of nature towards its health?
In 1926, the illness was identified. It was leukemia. To the very end, Rilke refused all pain relief. He wanted to keep his mind alert, to carry on writing.
Now come the last that I can recognize. Pain. Utter pain. Fierce in the body's texture. As once in the mind I burned, so now I burn in you. The wood resisted, long denied acceptance to the flame you blazed at me. But now I feed you, and in you I flare. My mildness here in your hot rage must turn to hellish rage, hell fury kindled there. Quite pure of forethought, futureless and free, I mounted suffering's tangled criss-crossed pyre, so sure there was no purchase to acquire for this heart's future. All its store now silent. What burns there so transmuted? Is that I? Into this fire I drag no memory. To be alive, to be outside, and I ablaze, with no one who knows me.